Great. So I'm pleased to introduce our final speaker of the session, Ariana Diaz, who is going to tell us about the relationship between learning to walk and increased vocabulary in infants.
Thank you. So as Dr. Prenchek had mentioned, I'm just going to be going over the relationship between learning to walk and increased vocabulary in infants. So in this presentation, we're interested in the changes that happen as infants transition from crawling to walking. So towards the first year of life, infants are experiencing changes in their cognitive and motor abilities. And in past studies, they've shown that these may be related. So for instance, learning to walk earlier is correlated with a larger vocabulary when measured towards the end of an infant's first year. However, it is unlikely that learning how to walk directly leads to a larger vocabulary, but it's more likely that the ability to walk may change the way an infant interacts and explores their environment. So for example, the motor abilities for walkers and crawlers are very different. When locomoting, crawlers are limited to what's in view, whereas walkers are able to see a much different scene and are able to use their hands to carry objects while they're locomoting. So we want to know, how does walking change infants' experiences? Well, walking infants take more steps and move longer distances than crawling infants. So infants are more likely to effectively explore their environment, which can allow for greater object interaction. And walkers receive more complex verbal responses from caregivers when interacting with objects compared to crawlers. So verbal responses can change the way that they experience new social interactions now that they're able to walk more, especially when they have an object in their hand. So it's clear that walking is changing everyday behaviors and opportunities for learning. But in this study, however, we're more interested in the potential role of object interaction between walking and language. So previous studies have shown that the ability to grasp objects is not related to vocabulary size. However, the role of infants' frequency of interacting with objects is what we're going to be examining. So for our research goal, we would first like to replicate the finding that walking onset is correlated with language development, and indirectly is object interaction resulting from walking experience, and is that then leading to language development. So you can imagine that an infant who can walk is able to carry objects in ways that they couldn't when they were crawling. As I've stated before, this change in object interaction changes how caregivers talk to infants. So for example, parents could be saying, "Could you bring me that ball?" or "Hey, can you grab that toy?" So putting labels on different objects, and these types of experiences could lead to improved language development. So for our methods, we have a planned sample size of 50 infants, but as of right now, we have an N of 27 participants that have completed the study. So that's what I'm going to be reporting. Parents have reported infant behavior via survey text messages, and infant behavior was recorded longitudinally from 10 to 13 months. So in the entirety of our study, there will be 4 monthly sessions. So we have sessions when the infant is 10 months old, 11 months old, and 12 months old, and 13 months old. And in each session, we will be asking parents to select 4 days in which they'll be receiving 10 text messages to make up a total of 120 surveys that will be sent after a 4-month period. So here we have an example of how parents receive survey questions through text message. The survey text messages were designed to be simple questions that parents could respond to in under a minute. For example, we would ask parents to report whether their child was holding an object with either a yes or a no. To collect our data, in order to measure object interaction, we used parents' responses from surveys to estimate the proportion of time where infants were interacting with carryable objects. To measure walking onset, in between sessions, we asked parents about motor milestones so that we could identify the age that infants began walking. And to measure language development, we used an online language assessment to measure the amount of words that they were able to produce and understand at 13 months old. Using the data we collected, here's some descriptive statistics of our measures. So for object interaction, we used parents' reports to find that infants were spending an average of 43.5% of their time with objects in their hands. So about less than half of the time that we're measuring their behavior, infants were carrying an object. For walking onset, at 13 months, only 51% of infants were walking, with a mean onset of walking at 12.4 months, so a little bit after a year. And for language development, on average, infants understood 77.92 words, but based on a minimum and maximum amount, it seemed that language development varied widely. So now I'm just going to be going over the relationship between walking and language. When we consider only the infants who were able to walk, earlier onset of walking was correlated with more words understood, with a correlation of negative 0.69%. However, if we take into account non-walking infants, there was no significant difference between the number of words understood by walkers and non-walkers. So what this means is that when we consider infants who cannot walk, there seems to be an equal language understanding between walkers and non-walkers. As you can see from the graph, the dots represented are roughly around the same areas. So going back to this image, what we have established is that there is a relationship between walking onset and language development, but only for participants in the sample who could walk at 13 months old. Our next step was to see if object interaction could explain this relationship. So if we go back to look at the role of object interaction, we can see that when analyzing only the infants who were able to walk, object interaction did not mediate the relationship between walking and vocabulary size. What we came to find from these results is the age that infants began to walk is correlated with language development. However, we would need to measure motor development beyond 13 months to accurately capture walking onset of the other 49% of our sample who could not walk to see if the relationship persists. Our other takeaway from our study is that the proportion of time spent interacting with objects does not explain the relationship between walking and language development. But there could be other everyday experiences that may shape infants' opportunities for exploration and language development. There are several future directions that we would like to take on this project. So one of the interesting aspects of our data is that it was collected during the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. So it would be interesting to look at future data to see if the pandemic may have impacted opportunities for socialization and activity interactions. Also, because our data was collected from participants across the United States, as long as they had cell phone service, we would be able to message them to see if we could look at potential demographic influences. For instance, looking at different zip codes and different SES to see if this can impact our data. And we could possibly look at other things like the number of people within a household size. Before I conclude the presentation, I just want to give a special thanks to all of the members of the Perception Action Development Lab, all of our participating families, and our funders. Thank you. Are there any questions?
All right. Thank you, Ariana. So you can stop your recording.